My name is Penelope Walker. I'm 40 years old. On paper, I'm the chief legal officer of a major nonprofit organization based in New York. The wife of Andrew Walker, CEO of Walker Holdings and sole heir to one of the oldest financial empires in America. The daughter-in-law of Margaret Walker, a woman feared across Manhattan's financial circles. And that night, in a lavish 60th floor penthouse overlooking the city, they threw me a 40th birthday party as if presenting an award to the perfect daughter-in-law. Over 100 guests, politicians, bank presidents, media figures. Celebrities raised their champagne glasses to toast me. But I knew none of them were really there for me. They came for the name Walker. Then, in a single second, everything shattered. Andrew, my husband, slapped me across the face. The room fell completely silent. I felt the sting on my cheek, the taste of blood at the corner of my mouth. But I didn't fall. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, tapped a button, and said clearly, "Go live." A beep echoed from 3 guests scattered around the room. They removed their earpieces. And I smiled. Have you ever been treated like a puppet just to maintain someone else's perfect image? Have you ever lived in a family where the fear of being controlled was greater than the fear of being alone? If so, leave a comment below. Hit like, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel to hear what happened next after that slap. Because the slap was only the beginning. I used to think that from the outside looking in, anyone would believe I was the luckiest woman in America. I lived in an $18 million penthouse in Manhattan, once featured on the cover of Architectural Digest. 8-meter ceilings, Italian marble floors, an open-concept kitchen with a Swiss-imported automatic wine storage system. From the bedroom window, I could see the Brooklyn Bridge, Union Square, and the sparkling Square for Hue. Lights along the Hudson River every night. I owned couture dresses custom-made in Paris, spoke at major legal conferences, and was honored for my philanthropic work through the Walker Foundation. I was the wife of Andrew Walker, the man Forbes once called the great hope of legacy finance. Tall, composed, with dual MBAs from Wharton and MIT. He was always impeccably dressed, spoke with precision, and oversaw nearly 10 subsidiaries within Walker Holdings. When we entered a boardroom, all eyes turned toward us as if they were watching royalty in the financial world. And my mother-in-law Margaret Walker was the one who built most of it. Margaret was once a distinguished professor of behavioral science at Columbia University. Before stepping away from academia, she served as a psychological advisor to several state governors and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. She was brilliant, sharp, and always knew how to enter a room with the perfect smile, the perfect tone at the perfect moment. But beneath that polished exterior was a mind trained to manipulate, and she applied it to her own family as if it were a long-term experiment that only she was allowed to control. I used to think she loved me in her own way, cold, distant, but still caring. But then I realized I had never been a person in her eyes. Not someone with emotions, desires, and dreams of my own. I was just part of a plan. A tool. An asset. I remember the day Margaret handed me a finely printed fertility calendar on ivory paper, embossed with the logo of a luxury wellness brand. "Penelope," she said softly, "this is your ovulation tracking schedule. Anna, my assistant, will help you input the data each month." I forced a smile. "I think that's something Andrew and I should manage privately." She placed a hand on my shoulder, still smiling gently, but her eyes didn't smile. "My dear, this is about the health and future of our family. A smart woman understands the importance of time. Preparation." That was the first moment I felt true fear. After the wedding, everything around me slowly restructured according to the Walker family standard. My friends began to withdraw because my invitations were often declined due to Andrew's schedule or mother's commitments. Casual gatherings were replaced by galas where I had to stand beside Margaret, arm in arm with my husband, smiling as if I belonged there. Even the way I dressed was edited. "That red dress is too bold," Margaret once commented. "Walker women should project softness with stability. Try pearl or pale blue instead." Before long, my wardrobe was filled with pastel dresses, modest cuts, conservative necklines. That wasn't me. But over time, I began to forget who me even was. Every morning, I woke up in a grand bed with lavender-scented linens, staring at the breathtaking cityscape and feeling empty, as if trapped inside a crystal prison. Andrew used to make me smile with just a glance. He once sat for hours in the library just to listen to me recap major court cases. Once bought me an old book simply because I had mentioned it 3 years ago during a date. But after he returned to work under his mother, he changed bit by bit. He became serious, cold, and lifeless. I noticed that every time Margaret whispered something in Andrew's ear during family gatherings, his eyes would change. After her advice, Andrew began speaking to me in a deep, even tone, so precise it was unsettling. Penelope, Mother believes we should consider having children before you age too far. Penelope, your public image needs more refinement when attending charity events. Penelope, don't let personal feelings damage the family's reputation. I used to push back. I cried. I screamed in the middle of the night, asking him, Andrew, are you still yourself? But he looked at me like I was a riddle he couldn't solve. Margaret never raised her voice. But every time I declined one of her suggestions, a silent consequence would follow. A schedule mysteriously changed. A news article about internal tension appeared on a finance blog. A grant from the foundation delayed. Invisible fingers pulling strings. I began keeping a journal. Not by hand, but on an encrypted laptop. Eli, my college best friend, sent me after hearing my voice on a call and saying, "That's not the Penelope I used to know." I documented Andrew's reactions. Archived Margaret's emails. Took photos of strange family meetings where I was the only one who didn't understand why every word felt rehearsed to perfection. I knew something was wrong. Not just control. A system. A program. A plan built long ago, with me as a piece placed exactly where they wanted. I used to be a lawyer. I understood logic. I understood evidence. And I understood that to escape a perfectly designed network like this, I couldn't rely on emotion. I had to rebuild an entire case as if I were investigating a criminal organization. Every night, as the city lights shimmered beyond the bedroom window, I opened my encrypted laptop, sat at the vanity, the clock ticking behind me, and began collecting the fragments that might, one day, to help me break free from this prison. And I didn't know when, but I knew when that slap landed. I was ready. I started noticing a change in Andrew's eyes one February morning, as we were having breakfast by the large window overlooking Central Park. Winter sunlight angled in, gray skies reflected in the espresso he was stirring. His hand moved rhythmically, but his eyes were blank, as if he was staring through me without actually seeing. "You okay?" I asked, placing my hand on his. Andrew flinched slightly, then nodded quickly, like a reflex. "Yeah, I'm just thinking about the investor meeting this morning." I smiled softly, but my heart wasn't at ease. 3 minutes earlier he had taken a call from his mother. And after he hung up, that look appeared distant, cold, as if all color had been drained from him. It didn't happen just once. I started keeping notes, an old habit from my days teaching law. After every call between Andrew and Margaret, I noticed he tended to follow the same chain of reactions. Losing focus, repeating phrases, and always ending with a perfectly staged gesture like he was reading from a script. A sudden hug. A bouquet delivered to his office. A dinner reservation at a place I had mentioned once. Years ago. Everything was correct on the surface, but wrong in the way it was done. One evening, after I had turned off the living room lights, Andrew turned to me and said, "I think we should revisit the plan to have children." I looked at him. "I'm not ready," I replied bluntly. "My work is at a critical point. I'm leading a discrimination case that could set a national precedent. I can't pause right now." He was silent for a second. Then, suddenly, he gripped my wrist. Not hard, but tight enough that I flinched, and long enough that I felt a chill run down my spine. 3 seconds. His expression in that moment wasn't angry. It was empty. No emotion. Then he let go almost immediately. "I'm sorry," he whispered, still not making eye contact. I stepped back, my hand still numb. In that moment, a quiet sound echoed inside me like the snap of a dry branch in a winter forest. I didn't know what it was, but I understood. Andrew was no longer the man I had loved. The next day, I asked Eli, the only college friend I still spoke with, to help me install microsurveillance software on Andrew's phone. I didn't want to believe he was doing anything wrong. I just wanted to understand what was really happening. "I know you're not doing this out of jealousy," Eli said as he helped set up the system. "But Pen, you have to be careful. This is a game played by people who never leave a trace." I nodded. "You think I've never seen a puppet built so perfectly that the puppet itself doesn't know it's a puppet?" I said, my voice bitter. 3 weeks later, I had copies of his entire call history, text messages, and even recordings of speakerphone conversations Andrew had never known about. And I discovered the first thing that took my breath away. In a 6-minute recording, Margaret spoke to Andrew in a honeyed, soothing tone. "My dear, when Penelope resists the plan to have children, that's a deviation. She needs a clear reminder." Not harsh, just a firm assertion. "A clear reminder?" Andrew repeated, as if memorizing. "You know," she said slowly. "Just 3 seconds. Then apologize. The emotional response after the action is the tool that stabilizes the system." "A system?" I stopped the recording there, my hand shaking. I sat in my study for 2 hours with the lights off, staring at the screen as if looking into an abyss. What were they doing to him? It wasn't that Andrew wanted to squeeze my wrist. He didn't decide that. It was the signal his mother had programmed in advance. I began combing through every detail of our married life. I reviewed family videos, interviews, every public appearance we had made. In Andrew's eyes, I began to recognize repeating patterns. Whenever Margaret was near, he would say the same phrases with almost copied intonation. I went back through photo albums. In one picture from a charity fundraiser 2 years earlier, I stood between Margaret and Andrew. Margaret's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, but her index finger pressed into a hollow at his neck, just where I had once studied reflex points in a neuroscience lecture. After that press, Andrew turned to me and said, "Pen, you should stay quiet about the financial plans. Those things aren't suitable for a wife's image." I had forgotten that moment. But now I remembered it clearly. Margaret was orchestrating Andrew's every reaction, from the look in his eyes, to what he said, to even intimate gestures. I opened the behavior modification plan I had retrieved from Margaret's printer when I visited her house the day before. A thick dossier titled, Emotional Realignment Program. Phase 2. Maintaining Power in Family-Level Relationships. There were diagrams, models, and charts showing how emotions were mapped to keywords, and how physical reflexes were used to reinforce mental programming. Andrew wasn't a cold man. He had been turned into a tool in his mother's hands. And I wasn't just the hurt wife. I was the second experimental subject in that plan. I looked in the mirror. My face hadn't changed: brown eyes, light brown hair, smooth skin. But in my eyes there was something I had never seen before. Awakening. I couldn't walk away without knowing the whole truth. I couldn't abandon Andrew as if he had vanished completely. But to save him, I needed evidence. I needed to understand how this system worked. And I needed help from people stronger than me. I began going to a place I had sworn I'd never return to: the FBI's Manhattan field office. In my bag that day was a hard drive containing 11 recordings, more than 50 pages of documents, and a list of transfers from the Walker Foundation to various personal psychological consulting organizations. And I knew this was only the first step. A storm had only just begun. I had never thought I would have to investigate the very home I lived in. But when trust is torn apart by programmed behaviors hidden behind every word and touch, the truth becomes the only thing that can save reason. Right after I left the FBI office that day, I began to act. One step at a time. No hurry. No mistakes. I knew that if I showed any sign, Margaret would notice. She wasn't the kind of person to wait for a crisis to react. She always moved one step ahead of all of us until I started moving too. First, I created an anonymous cloud account. The servers were located in a country that had no data sharing treaty with the United States. I used an identifier that had never been associated with anything on the Walker system. Inside, I set up a multi-layer encrypted archive containing every audio file, image, observational log, and even the psychological notes I wrote each night. Then I reached out to Eli. We met at a small cafe in Brooklyn. The place had no security cameras, used handwritten menus, and didn't accept credit cards, a place nearly invisible to the Walker family's surveillance network. When I handed Eli the draft plan, he was silent for a long moment, just looking at me. The eyes of someone who had shared a dorm room with me in our final year of college, who knew my worst habits, the nights I couldn't sleep under pressure, the way my eyes lit up when I taught. "Pen," Eli said softly, "are you sure?" "I had no choice," I answered. "I cannot keep living in a performance written by someone else. And I can't let Andrew keep being controlled like a puppet. You've seen the documents. This is no longer a marital issue. This is systematic psychological abuse." Eli nodded. He pulled out a small box containing 3 mini pin-size cameras, with local Wi-Fi connectivity and automatic output encryption using technology he'd developed for an investigative journalism team in Central America. He also brought an AI device for facial expression recognition, integrated with audio and light sensors sophisticated enough to analyze whether a spoken line came from conscious intent or a programmed reflex. "This device will record micro-expressions, the tiny movements of the eyes, eyebrows, the corners of the mouth," Eli explained. "It can identify moments when Andrew shows an abnormal response. And when you combine that with historical call data, behavior, and tone, we can reconstruct a map of his emotional programming." I held the device in my hand, feeling both fear and relief. I didn't want to believe what I was about to prove, but I could no longer pretend. The next day, when Andrew left for work, I installed 2 cameras in the study and the living room, places where he usually took calls with Margaret over Zoom or made private phone calls. The third camera I placed in the entry to the walk-in closet, pointed at the mirror he stood in front of every morning. I knew he had a habit of murmuring to himself what Margaret had called internal reinforcement, and I needed everything, even the unconscious whispers. With Eli's software support, I began recording voice, facial expressions, every tiny furrow of the brow, squint, and delayed reaction after a call from Margaret. The system flagged in red each time Andrew had a reaction that didn't match the conversation content, for example, nodding while being criticized, or going silent when receiving praise. I saved every video clip, every audio file, and wrote notes each night. I also logged my own feelings, not to accuse, but to understand. To know whether I still loved a human being, or was only pitying a programmed set of responses that had been abused since childhood. One night I reviewed more than 3 hours of footage of Margaret and Andrew sitting in the study, speaking in very low tones. I had to raise the volume nearly double and filter noise with the decoder Eli had custom installed. Margaret said, "When she starts to doubt, you must act immediately. A punitive action will remind her of her role." Andrew replied without hesitation, "Yes, 3 seconds, then apologize." I felt myself hold my breath. My throat tightened. It was the exact match of the response he had used on me, squeezing my hand for 3 seconds and then letting go. I had proof in my hands that Margaret was directly instructing Andrew to control me through physical behavior. Not violence in the traditional sense, but a form of soft power. Setting. A type of abuse that's hard to prosecute, yet deeply damaging. I reprinted the documents, saved them to an encrypted portable drive, and duplicated them on 2 overseas servers. All had automatic codes to send the files if I didn't log in within 72 hours. To conceal my activity, I still attended events, stood beside Andrew and Margaret as if nothing had happened. I smiled. I shook hands. I wore the dresses they chose, although I secretly hid a tiny tracker and a mini microphone in the lining devices Eli had installed. I was a puppet, but a puppet that knew exactly where the strings came from, and day by day, I began to cut them one by one. In my journal I wrote, Day 41. Andrew came home after a call with his mother. He sat at the table, offered me a piece of salmon, and said he'd missed me all day. But his eyes didn't smile. I asked, "Do you really miss me?" He nodded. But the AI system flagged a mismatched expression. I watched him throughout that meal, and I realized the man across from me no longer knew he was performing. He believed what he said, but I knew those words had long ago been planted in his mind. And I was becoming the only remaining witness who could expose the whole script. A script written with counterfeit love, absolute obedience and fear programmed to the core. I discovered the document titled Realignment Protocol one Wednesday afternoon, when Andrew was at a conference in Chicago and Margaret called to say she would be at the Hamptons Spa for the weekend. The penthouse is nearly 800 square meters, but I knew every tile and every lock. I had lived there long enough to know where every decorative object belonged, but there was one room I had never entered alone: Margaret's office. A room she only used when she stayed over, rarely opened. It also contained the only safe in the house for which I didn't have the code. But I knew that could change. Margaret often used Andrew's birthday as a backup password for everything. I bet she still kept that habit. I tried 082481. The safe clicked softly. The door popped open. Inside were thick bound files, financial documents, Walker Foundation reports, and one untitled gray folder tied with a black ribbon. When I opened it, the first page displayed 3 bold lines. Project Realignment, Confidential, Internal, Use Only. Beneath were 2 names: Margaret Walker, Behavioral Architect, Dr. Felix Grant, Clinical Implementer. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. My hands shook as I flipped to the next page. The document detailed a behavior modification program developed for Subject A, Andrew, from when he was 10 years old. The stated rationale: emotional instability, family resistance, tendency toward independent development beyond control. A table listed the full set of punitive reflexes encoded in words and physical behaviors. I read lines such as keyword leave, reaction, activate slap reflex, execute within 2 seconds, followed by display of remorse. Keyword freedom, privacy, decision reaction, hand squeeze or brief physical pressure, accompanied by prolonged silence. Keyword mother is wrong or I disagree reaction, jaw twitch. Anxious behavior requires recalibration afterward. I read on to page 14, a progress tracking chart over the years, including psychological reinforcement sessions carried out at a private facility in Vermont under the cover of a summer academic program. Every summer, for 8 consecutive years, Andrew was sent there, a place I had never heard him mention. I touched the stark lines as if touching a wound that had never been bandaged. An attached photo made my blood run cold. Andrew, about 12 years old, sitting in a white room with a bespectacled man, Dr. Grant, I assumed, across from him. Andrew's face was utterly blank, eyes fixed on the camera. The boy didn't smile. He didn't show fear. He was empty. I turned to the last page. There was a handwritten note from Margaret. Subject A shows mild resistance when separated from emotionally attached objects. Need to sever outside attachments completely to ensure absolute dependency. Recommendation: control marriage by selecting a suitable wife. Prefer an intelligent, disciplined subject who is compliant under increased pressure. I stopped, my heart racing. Those lines were not just about Andrew. They were about me. I, the one Margaret chose, praised, introduced at legal conferences, and encouraged Andrew to pursue. I, the person introduced to the family 2 months after our first meeting, with a wedding so fast my friends barely understood what had happened. I was not a wife that Andrew loved naturally. I was part of a control plan his mother had carried out for more than 2 decades. I closed the dossier, slipped it into my encrypted document bag, and put everything back in the safe as before. But from that moment on, I had no doubts left. That night, when Andrew came home, I looked at him for a long time under the dining room light. He set his bag down, took off his coat, and smiled gently. "How was your day?" he asked. "Fine," I replied. "I read some old documents. Just thinking a lot. Do you need my help?" He stepped closer and put a hand on my back. I looked at him. His eyes were still the brown I had loved, but now I couldn't help wondering how much of that look was real and how much was the result of 30 years of conditioning. I took a small step back. "I'm okay. You eat first, I'll reheat the salmon with butter sauce." "I like that dish," he smiled. I nodded. But inside, my thoughts went elsewhere. Did Andrew like it himself, or had Margaret programmed him to like it? I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind tap the glass of the 60th floor windows. In my mind, the image of the boy in the photo kept replaying. The empty gaze and Margaret's cold handwriting echoed. Sever outside attachments completely. I had thought I was chosen by her because I was special. But no. I was chosen because I was easily programmable. The next morning I contacted Agent Claire, the FBI agent I had met 2 weeks earlier. I have a document, I said over the phone, my voice steady. It's not just evidence. It's the spine of a 30-year human control program. And I think she didn't only do this to Andrew. There was a pause on the other end of the line for a few seconds. Do you want to file an official report? Claire asked. No, I answered. Not yet. I want you to help me define the scope. I want to know, how many Andrews are out there? I hung up, walked back to my desk, and opened my computer. I typed the title for the file I was creating, Dossier 001, Realignment Exposed. I knew I was stepping into a fight bigger than any lawsuit I had handled. But this time I wasn't representing a client. I was representing minds that had been stolen. And perhaps, starting with my husband. I sent the first set of documents to the FBI one early morning, when sunlight had just touched the western skyscrapers of Manhattan. The data package was compressed and triple encrypted, with a one-time password, a phrase Andrew had said to me the night he first proposed. You are something I never dared to hope for. I didn't send it as Penelope Walker. I signed it as Athena. Under the files I wrote one short line. I am not the only one. And I have proof. 7 days later I received a message from an unknown number. Penelope. Claire here. Remember the 2010 reunion in Cambridge? Meet for coffee at 10 a.m. Tomorrow. Corner of 43rd and Lexington. I owe you a caramel latte. I didn't have a college friend named Claire. I had never attended a reunion in Cambridge. But I went anyway. Claire was already waiting in the cafe, her brown hair tied back, wearing a taupe trench coat, clutching an old medical book as if waiting for a study partner. Her eyes were calm, but when I walked in, a single glance was enough for her to stand and offer the practiced smile of old friend. Penelope. Oh my, you haven't changed much, Claire said as if we had just seen each other yesterday. I forced a smile, sat down, my eyes never leaving the cup of coffee already placed before me. I guess, you're not a medical student, I whispered. Claire tilted her head slightly and smiled. You guessed right. And this latte is perfectly safe, no need to worry. We verified the cafe's cameras, no one is watching you. I asked. The FBI. I'm a federal agent working on an internal investigation into systematic behavioral control practices in private settings. We've been monitoring the Walker Foundation since 2018. But the file you sent, it's been a major turning point. I tightened my grip on the coffee cup. What do you want me to do? I asked. Claire shook her head. For now, nothing. What you've done so far is precise and cautious enough. But I think it's time you are not alone. I looked up. What do you mean? Claire pulled out a tablet, set it on the table, and opened a folder titled Category, Subject Conditioning Reports. A long list of names filled the screen. Not all of them were Walkers. These are people who worked at Walker Holdings subsidiaries or who were collaborators of the Walker Foundation in education and health programs. Teachers, accountants, engineers, even research scientists, she said. I read the notes column. Symptoms: extreme emotional dependency after intervention. Psychological harm due to controlled personal decision-making. Dissociative symptoms following training programs. Where do I fit in this list? I asked, my voice low. Claire's expression turned serious. You are not an ordinary victim. You are an exception. You have a legal background, resilience. But because of that, you are the only one who has stepped out of the model while still clear enough to observe it from the inside. I swallowed. And Andrew? I asked, unable to hide my worry. Claire hesitated for a moment. Andrew is Subject A. He's the first and most comprehensive model we've seen in the files. His conditioning began at age 10 and ran for more than 20 years. Every decision was guided by conditioned reflexes, combined with medication, auditory cues, and deliberately induced emotional traumas. My stomach twisted. Claire, can they do that to a child without anyone noticing? with resources, power, and a medical psychological system funded by the family's own foundation. Yes, they can. And they did. She switched the screen to another folder and played a video. The picture was grainy and the audio noisy, but I recognized Margaret. She stood beside a thin, dark-haired child about 13 years old, not Andrew. The boy recited scripted lines, each repeated 3 times, then stopped when Margaret nodded. You are part of a larger plan. You are not to disobey instructions. Freedom is dangerous. Disobedience is betrayal. I went numb. Not Andrew, I whispered. Claire nodded. Subject G. Real name, Nathan Greer. He was the chief accountant for Walker's Educational Resources subsidiary. Last year he took his own life. A cold shiver ran through me. Claire spoke slowly. The Walker Foundation isn't simply a charity. It's a cover for a behavior training system in many forms: summer camps, scholarship programs, even free therapy. They don't coerce people. They invite them, and then program them. I forced the words out. I need to bring this into the light. And you will, Claire replied, her eyes serious. But the right way. We need you to maintain your current position. Keep collecting, keep observing. We have signs of an insider in the organization. Someone is sending information, but can't reveal themselves yet. They trust you. I shook my head slowly. You're putting me in danger. We're protecting you. Your phone is being routed through 3 virtual nodes. Every device you use has 2 layers of encryption. And if anything happens, our system will automatically trigger the package you sent to be transmitted to the media. I looked at her, my eyes stinging. I'm not afraid for myself. I'm afraid for Andrew. Claire softened. We'll do everything to get Andrew out of that system without harming him further. But you are the key. I bowed my head, clasping the cold cup of coffee. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. But one thing was clear. I was no longer alone. And if I could be the first small light in that labyrinth, I wouldn't step back. Across the street, the glass Walker Tower glinted in the midday sun. I looked up, not with the old admiration, but with awareness. I had thought of that place as a symbol of power and achievement. Now I saw it as a gilded cage. And I would find a way out for everyone locked inside it. Even my husband. I began to mention the idea of a big birthday party in early April, during a family dinner at the rooftop of Celeste, the restaurant Margaret favored for meetings with international partners. I think, this year we should do something special, I said while Andrew was ordering. 40 years. A big milestone. I don't want to just have a quiet dinner with a few acquaintances like every year. Margaret set down her wine glass and smiled with complete control. What about a cocktail party at the Penthouse? She suggested in a light voice. The Manhattan night view will be the perfect backdrop for any dress you choose. I nodded. I love that idea. And I think we should invite a few more people. For the spirit of turning 40 and no longer hiding. Andrew looked at me, a flicker of surprise. I had always let Margaret decide the guest list. But this time I took charge. I knew Margaret wouldn't refuse. A spectacular party directed by her would reinforce the Walker family's standing in the financial world. Margaret pursed her lips. Fine. Leave everything to me. Book the catering, the guest list, the flowers, live music. Just pick a dress color. I smiled. Thank you, Mother. I'll choose the dress carefully. From that day, Margaret threw herself into arranging everything like a stage director. She sent me 4 mood boards for lighting concepts, fresh flower design, the wine menu, and even the placement of the chandeliers on the glass ceiling. She wanted every detail perfect. I agreed to all of it, because I needed the party to look like a real celebration. A lavish performance where every attendee would think they were witnessing a glamorous tribute. While they busied themselves choosing crystal glasses and Belgian vases, I had a different plan. I sent the signal to Claire. Date: April 19th. Location: Walker Penthouse. Critical window: from 7:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. High security. Devices must be installed at least 24 hours before the event. 3 hours later I received a reply. Confirmed. Tech team will support from the lower floor. Devices as chosen. Precise coordination required on your end. Eli was in as well. We met late on Tuesday night in the basement parking garage of a building near Times Square. He brought 3 lapel cameras, 2 button mics disguised as wine stoppers, 4 metal key fob audio recorders, and a small data transmission chip sticker to place on the edge of the vanity mirror. "Pen," Eli said, still assembling devices, "are you sure? One mistake, and even the FBI can't help in time." "I'm not doing this alone," I answered. "I have them. And I have me." We began installing the equipment the night before the party. I used the pretext of setting up and asked the cleaning staff not to enter certain rooms. I polished floors, changed table linens, rearranged picture frames while secretly slipping recorders into outlets, table legs, under chairs, and even the underside of the bar. A fake wall clock was placed in the center of the living room. Inside it was a super-wide camera connected to the FBI server via encrypted network. Andrew's dressing room mirror was fitted with a 2-layer reflective sticker chip capturing his reactions whenever he adjusted a tie or took a call from his mother. Everything happened in silence. In a house accustomed to a quiet that passed for normal, I took advantage of the complacency of people who thought they controlled everything. On the evening of April 19th, the sky was clear and crisp. I chose the red Dior dress Margaret had once said was too dramatic for the family image. I wore it for exactly that reason. Andrew looked at me as I stepped out of the dressing room. His eyes hesitated for half a second, then he said, "You look different." I smiled and fastened a button at my collar. "Different? Good different or bad different?" He hesitated. "Good. Very beautiful. But Mother will think I didn't wear it for Mother." I said softly and turned away before he could say more. At 7:30 p.m., guests began to arrive. Familiar faces from finance, the arts, and politics. I shook hands. I smiled. I toasted with each person. The recorder was triggered precisely at 7:27 p.m. when I opened the first bottle of white and placed the special stopper into the ice bucket. Claire arrived at 7:40 p.m., playing the role of my old college friend Marianne. She wore a navy satin dress, a hydrangea pinned at her shoulder, and a tiny earpiece with a fake signal card. "I'm a bit late because of the train," Claire said as she hugged me. "No worries. Thank you for coming. The party is gorgeous, Penelope. And it will get even better," I whispered in her ear. "Be ready." Margaret entered at that moment, hair in a high chignon, wearing a 3-strand pearl necklace and a black Chanel coat. She swept her eyes over the room, pleased as if she were viewing the crowning work of her reign. I went to her and embraced her lightly. "Thank you for putting all this together." She smiled. "A special occasion deserves perfection. And, remember, pick the right timing. There will be a small family announcement. James will speak as well." I looked at her. An announcement? Just some directional remarks about the future. Right time, right place. I nodded. Inside, I understood she was preparing another controlling move. Maybe about children. Maybe about my role in the Walker Foundation. Or maybe the official strike to remove me from the circle of control when she felt I was no longer sufficiently compliant. But she didn't know. I had planted the truest eyes all through this room. They did not blink. Every look, every whisper, every loaded touch had been fed into the system. I stood in the center of the room, in my flaming red dress, a glass of wine in my hand, looking around. The party had begun. And the play was about to reach its final act. The piano kept playing a classical piece as Margaret gently tapped a crystal glass, signaling the room to fall silent. "Before dessert," she began, "I have a few words about the woman we're celebrating tonight." I stood not far away, under the warm yellow lights, my hands loosely folded over my stomach. To those around me, I probably looked like I was waiting for a compliment from my mother-in-law. But only I knew my heart was beating tightly to a prearranged rhythm. Penelope is not only a devoted wife and an excellent lawyer. She has been a symbol of Time's wife, stability for the Walker family in recent years, Margaret continued, her eyes sweeping the faces in the room as if she were playing the lead role in a familiar opera. "She's the one who has kept this family moving forward." I smiled and nodded lightly as polite applause rose. No one noticed my hand had discreetly touched the recording key hidden in the leather clutch at my hip. The device had been live for 2 minutes. The off-site server was ready to receive the data stream. Margaret ended with a cold kiss on my cheek and a shoulder squeeze just firm enough to make anyone feel loved. Then she signaled Andrew to step forward. A small microphone was placed in his hand as if he were preparing to address a financial conference. Andrew stood beside me, a faint smile on his face, but his eyes did not meet mine. Not fully. They were a little off, as if he were reading a draft in his head. I knew I had exactly 30 seconds before Margaret delivered the family announcement, part of the control plan I'd already anticipated. I turned to him, my voice low enough that the guests nearby would think it was a loving whisper. Andrew, I think after tonight, I will leave you. Everything stopped. In less than a second I saw his jaw twitch. His pupils constricted. His left wrist tightened against his trouser seam. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, Andrew turned and raised his hand. The sound of the slap landed hard like glass cracking. I did not flinch. The room fell into a silence that felt total. I staggered half a step, the taste of blood at the corner of my mouth, the scent of Andrew's cologne still lingering on the cheek he had struck. But I did not cry. I lifted my head, smoothed my dress, and laughed. A clear, ringing laugh, not a single note of pretense. The silence pressed even thicker against the glass walls of the rooftop. I looked at the camera hidden in the white orchid arrangement in the corner, the small, red light that only I could see. You have just witnessed a programmed response, I said, my voice steady. FBI, you may come in. Claire immediately stepped out of the frozen cluster near the wine table. She flashed her badge and spoke in a professional, firm tone. No one is to leave their positions. This is a federal investigation. Everything here is being recorded. Please cooperate. Her voice cut the heavy air like a blade. Andrew stood motionless. His eyes began to tremble. He stared at the hand that had struck me as if it did not belong to him. Pen, I don't understand what's happening, he stammered. Margaret stepped forward, trying to hold her smile. What is this? Penelope, what are you doing? I turned to her and took the microphone from Andrew's hand. You know exactly what I'm doing. And I know exactly what I'm saying, I replied, facing the woman who had directed everything in the shadows for years. I raised the pad of Lee work, microphone high. Hello everyone. My name is Penelope Walker, and I will confirm, this 40th birthday party is not a celebration. It is an exposure. I turned to Andrew. He just slapped me, in front of hundreds of people, not because he was angry, but because his brain has been programmed to react that way to the word leave. All eyes swung to him. Claire signaled the technical team to move in. 2 men who had been posing as servers stepped forward and removed their earpieces, revealing the signal transmitters hidden beneath their jackets. Margaret took a step back. This is slander, she shouted. I will sue you for defamation. You will need a good lawyer, I replied. I am holding the entire realignment protocol dossier, the documents that record how you and Dr. Felix Grant trained Andrew from age 10. They include the list of emotional reflexes you linked to specific keywords. I turned to the guests, politicians, investors, professors, and foundation executives. People who had sat at our table countless times, unaware of what they were witnessing. I know many of you still won't believe it, but what you just saw is not random. It is the result of more than 20 years of behavior control. And I recorded everything. Andrew fell to his knees, hands over his head. Pen, is this real? He asked. I did not answer. I only looked at him. In his eyes I glimpsed the man who had once whispered his love so softly I had to lean close to hear. Claire approached Margaret, her tone icy. Margaret Walker, under federal investigation orders, you are being detained on suspicion of organized psychological abuse, financial fraud, and human rights violations through behavior training programs. Please come with us. Margaret stood motionless. The same look, hard, calculating. But I saw something crack in that expression. You don't believe things can fall apart because you think you've programmed everything. But you forgot one thing, I said. No program can stop awakening. And at that moment, the cameras, microphones, every device installed in the penthouse simultaneously transmitted data to the FBI servers. Whispers, coded glances, every time Margaret touched Andrew at a reflex point, were analyzed, encrypted, and stored. Within minutes, the power she had held began to melt away. Not because someone wrested it from her, but because her own hand had just shattered the last mask. And I trained to bow, stood upright, my cheeks still marked in red, but my heart utterly free. Margaret was handcuffed, but she refused to follow the two agents escorting her toward the secure elevator. She yanked away, her eyes flashing with fury, and I heard her voice break into a scream instead of the usual honeyed admonitions. "You don't understand," she shouted, her eyes sweeping the room for allies. "I did it all to protect this family. For its safety. For the boy is 39 years old." I cut in, my voice steady and cold as steel. "And from age 10 until now, you never let him live a normal childhood, Margaret." "Not once." "No," she roared, hair falling from her bun, tears starting to gather. "Don't you see how obedient he is? He is the stability every empire needs. My son will never stray. He will never betray." "I didn't betray," Andrew said, his voice small but ringing through the hushed banquet hall. "You betrayed him," Margaret faltered. I looked at Andrew. He stood there, shoulders trembling slightly, hands still shaking uncontrollably. But in his eyes that had been blank for so many years, there was now something more real than I had ever seen. "You don't love me," he said, stepping back. "You controlled me. You steered my whole life as if I weren't a person but a project." Margaret shook her head repeatedly, but she had no rebuttal. The devices were still recording. The guests were still watching. "Andrew," I said softly, stepping toward him slowly, my hand outstretched. "You don't have to say anything more if you don't want to." He looked at me, and when our eyes met, his tears spilled uncontrollably. I had never seen that man cry. Not once. But now he was like a child awakening from a 29-year trance. "Penelope," he whispered, a sob caught in his throat. "Who am I?" I stood before him, gently touching his wet cheek, not to forgive, but because I understood that the person collapsing before me was not the husband I had once known. He was the real human being buried under a lifetime of inhuman conditioning. "You're someone who has the right to choose himself again," I said, and he broke down like a child into my shoulder. Behind us, agents continued reading search warrants, sealing documents, servers, and the Walker Foundation's accounts. One of them handed me a newly printed file. "We've verified nearly 20 manipulated grant contracts, more than $60 million laundered through shell nonprofit organizations, and a list of over 30 people who were subjects of the realignment project," he said. I took the file and flipped to the first page. There were names I'd heard whispered at family parties, people who had given me wedding gifts, who once called me the woman who calms Andrew down. Now I understood why they said it. I turned to Claire, who was coordinating the scene. "How many of them are still alive?" I asked. She was silent for a few seconds. 18. "Some are in states of psychiatric disorder, a few have temporary memory loss, and some no longer have cognitive function comparable to an ordinary person." "And Dr. Grant?" I asked. "Where is he?" "He's under surveillance at his home. We have a search warrant and a subpoena ready. But with what you provided and the evidence collected tonight, we will move to execute an arrest within 24 hours. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the list. Each line was a life manipulated, a story rewritten by someone else's hand. By near midnight, most guests had been given preliminary interviews. Some still tried to maintain appearances and left with polite masks and frightened eyes. A few others, those who had cooperated with the Walker Foundation, began asking about how they could assist the investigation. As I passed the buffet table, I noticed my glass of champagne still untouched. I lifted it, holding it at eye level, the lights reflected in the pale gold liquid. "I used to think this stood for joy," I told myself. "But tonight, it's evidence of the elite's silence over wrongdoing, simply because they were invited to sit at the table." Andrew sat a few steps away, being tended by a medical technician, his blood pressure being taken and neurological responses checked. When he saw me watching, he forced a smile. I did not return it with a smile. But I nodded. Not out of forgiveness, but because I understood, He had not chosen this. Claire came over and handed me a thin file. "We want you to be the lead witness in the federal proceedings," she said. "The materials you provided are the foundation of the entire case." I took it, feeling in my hands a portion of truth that could no longer be hidden. A part of history would be rewritten not by journalists or spokespeople, but by those who had survived inside that darkness. Claire looked at me for a long moment. "Penelope, if you want to step back, we will protect you. You have done enough," she said. I shook my head. "I haven't begun," I said, eyes drifting to a corner of the room where a painting Margaret had commissioned still hung a serene Vermont lakeside sunset. The place she had once said was Andrew's happiest childhood summer. Now I knew, that is where the experiment began. And I will not let another summer like that happen to anyone again. 6 months after that, birthday night, when the final set of handcuffs clicked shut around Margaret's wrists in the federal courthouse, I stood behind the spectator benches, my hands folded across my chest, silent like someone who had waited years for that verdict, not out of gloating, but to close a dark chapter of life. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison on charges related to systematic psychological abuse, money laundering through charitable organizations, high-level financial manipulation, and human rights violations. No one asked for leniency for her. Even the defense attorney, at the last minute, bowed his head as if he too were part of the game she had lost. Andrew was not present for the sentencing. He was receiving treatment at a specialized psychological recovery center in rural Maine, where pine forests stretch and a clear lake lies still, a place so quiet that the programmed voices in his head had to stop to hear the wind. I had no direct contact with him during those 6 months, but every month a letter arrived at the mailbox of my newly founded organization, True Will Foundation. Each letter began in the same slanted, steady handwriting. "Penelope, if you are reading these lines, there are 3 things I want to tell you." Each letter was an apology. Not just for that slap, but for the hundreds of times he repeated behaviors he no longer remembered committing. He apologized for letting his mother drive every choice, for believing silence was a form of love. And he always signed off with a short line: "I do not expect forgiveness, but I hope you are free." I read them. I folded them carefully. I did not reply. Not because I was angry, but because I understood that some forgiveness needs no words. And it does not require a return. The True Will Foundation's office sits on the 4th floor of a red brick building in Brooklyn. Not glamorous. No gold-plated sign. But the door is always open. Each week we intake more than 10 cases from people who have experienced living as if they no longer control themselves. Some were senior employees, some were students who had received scholarships from behavioral education programs, and there were wives and husbands like me who thought they lived in love until they realized the whole thing was a script written by someone else. I did not work alone. Claire left the FBI after the case closed. She said that years as an agent taught her one thing clearly: the law can handle criminals, but only the community can heal victims. She volunteered to become the legal support program director for the foundation and co-wrote toolkits with me to help identify psychological manipulation in families and organizations. Eli handled the technical side. He developed an encrypted platform that allows victims to record, store, and send evidence without revealing their identities. He often said, "Not everyone has clean evidence like you, so I'll help them build it." I still remember the first workshop we held. Only 7 people attended. There was a woman in her 50s with prematurely gray hair from stress, sitting quietly at the back. When I finished speaking about psychological self-determination, she raised her hand and asked, trembling, "If I've let them control me for 30 years, am I still worthy of freedom?" I stepped down, didn't answer immediately. I sat beside her, held her hand, and whispered, "If you're still asking that question, it means you've already stepped through the first door." From then on, the foundation gained new people every month. No 2 stories were the same, but they all shared the belief that they had lost their voice. And then they found it again. As for me, I still live in the small apartment I rented in Lower Manhattan. No penthouse, no bodyguard, no doorman. I do my own grocery shopping, choose each roll of toilet paper, make my morning coffee. Small things I once thought unnecessary. But I learned that those small things help me feel like myself. Every Monday morning I spend 15 minutes opening Andrew's letters, reading quietly as if he were sitting in front of me. In the most recent letter he wrote, "For the first time in my life, I chose a book to read. Not because it was on my mother's list, not because it would help my leadership profile. I chose it because I wanted to. It's a small thing, but for me, it's like a window opening for the first time after years sealed shut." I set the letter down without tears. Just a sense of lightness. I know I will not go back. I will not resurrect the old life, nor reconnect with Andrew, not because he is beyond trust, but because I need to move forward. Forgiveness is not a chain that binds two people who once loved each other. Forgiveness is letting go at the right moment so the other person can learn to stand. One late autumn evening I stood on the office balcony looking down at the street as the city lights turned on. Cold. Wind blew, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and smoke from a food cart on the corner. Claire came out with 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "I just got an email from the Vermont state government," she said, handing me a mug. "They want you to consult on a new law about psychological autonomy in education. They want to use your program as a model." I smiled softly. "Vermont?" "Yeah. The place where Margaret used to send Andrew to those emotional improvement summer camps year after year." I tightened my grip around the cocoa, looking out at the rows of blinking yellow lights. Maybe things should start again from where they went wrong. And I knew that not every wound needs time to heal. Some wounds need a single right choice. Don't turn back. Don't retaliate. Don't repeat. Just keep moving forward with awareness, and with real will. I remember that morning very clearly, a clear April morning, golden sunlight scattering across the glass roof of the conference hall in Boston. I walked into the TEDx backstage with a strange calm. Not fake composure, but the deep calm of someone who had walked through fear, hit the bottom of pain, and had nothing left to hide. I wore a simple black dress, no rhinestones, no exposed shoulders, nothing flashy. Partly because I wanted the audience to listen to the story, not look at me. Partly because I had learned to step out of the spotlight and let the truth stand under it. When the host introduced me, polite applause rose measured, neither too warm nor indifferent. I walked onto the stage holding the microphone, my eyes fixed on the front row. There was a young woman with a faint scar on her wrist, a middle-aged man bowing his head after the earlier talks, and in the left corner, Claire. I took a deep breath, then began. "Hello everyone, I'm Penelope. I used to think love was the greatest thing people could sacrifice for one another. Until I realized the thing I called love had been programmed in advance." No one laughed. No one moved. I told them about Andrew, the man who used to hold me to his chest every morning, and also the man who once squeezed my wrist when I said the word freedom. I told them about Margaret, the accomplished woman famous in philanthropic circles, who signed off on the realignment project that rewired her own son's personality. I told them about that birthday night, how I stood among candles and flowers to receive a programmed slap, and how that slap opened everything up. I spoke slowly. No flourish, no sensationalizing. I wanted listeners to understand clearly. Psychological manipulation doesn't always come with shouting. It can come from a look, a compliment, or even an embrace that seems kind. The scariest thing isn't that you're being controlled. It's that you don't know you're being controlled. When I paused in the middle of my talk, there was a very long silence. I saw a young woman in the third row, covering her mouth and crying. An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. A thin, balding man stood still, nodding. Then I spoke about choice. 6 months after that fateful slap, I didn't choose to go back. Not because I didn't still love that man, but because I couldn't keep loving in a relationship where he didn't even know who he was. I told them about the True Will Foundation, about the survivors who came to us, about the apology letters I read every week but never answered. I talked about relearning how to walk alone in the park without hearing the whispered "you should do this, you should choose that" from someone else. And then I said the final line I had held in my chest for months. Sometimes the laugh after the slap isn't madness. It's freedom. The air in the auditorium seemed to hold. Then, suddenly, there was a burst of applause. No one stood up immediately, but people clapped for a long time. Not for me. For themselves, for the recognition of something inside them. After the talk, Many people came to shake my hand, to hug me, to ask for the foundation's contact. But what moved me most was a small group of women, mostly over 40, standing together, saying little, exchanging looks of deep understanding, then pulling scraps of paper with phone numbers from their wallets. One of them said, "I didn't think I would ever tell anyone. But, if you could do it, maybe I can too." In the days that followed, the talk video spread quickly across social media. But the surprising thing wasn't the view count, it was the letters from universities. Columbia Law, Stanford, even Harvard wrote asking to use the birthday party footage as an example in courses on covert crimes and emotional manipulation in families. A professor at Northwestern emailed, "In hundreds of lectures on personal rights, I have never seen students remain silent and listen for 18 minutes like that." Short clips stitched from the rooftop footage showing Andrew raising his hand, his face shifting as if a switch flipped, and the slap ringing out in a luxurious room while laughter went on became official teaching materials. Psychologists called it a conditioned compulsion response rooted in childhood training. But for me, it was just a painful film of the past. I don't watch it again. I don't keep it on my devices. I won't let it define me. I let others use it to teach, to warn, to help. And I live on. One summer morning, while I was making coffee in the office kitchen, a young woman walked in. She wore a gray hoodie, her face thin, her eyes deep. "My name is Naomi," she whispered. "I was also taught how to love properly as a child. Like in your video." I didn't press. I pulled a chair out, invited her to sit, and set a warm glass of water in front of her. "You don't have to tell me everything right now," I said. "We have a whole day. And a whole life." Naomi cried. But it wasn't a cry of despair. It was the first drop of water when an inner door finally opens. And I know, every woman who dares to stand up is another light in a room we used to think would stay dark forever. If you've followed this far, you may have seen something of yourself or someone you once loved in my story. Maybe a woman quietly standing in a corner of a party, holding back tears when hurt by a family member. Maybe a man who witnessed control in his household and didn't know what to do. Or maybe a child raised under conditions they couldn't understand, taught only to obey. I'm not telling this story to be pitied. I tell it because I believe, when truth is spoken, it heals not just one person, but a whole community. Have you ever met someone like Andrew? Have you ever felt suffocated by an expectation called love? Or do you simply want to understand more about the hidden corners behind families that seem perfect? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could be the light for someone still stumbling in the dark. And if this story touched you, don't forget to follow the channel to continue this journey with me, where each story is not only a truth revealed but an invitation for you to enter the world of people learning to step out of pain and find themselves again. Because sometimes, a single right sentence at the right time can change a life.